Picture a corner booth at Chasen's restaurant, Beverly Hills, California. February 1969. The booth is tucked just far enough from the bar that the light thins out. Not dark, but dim, the way certain conversations prefer to stay. Two men in expensive suits lean toward each other across a white tablecloth, laughing. Not the easy laugh of men who've had a good evening. The tight, private laugh of men who believe no one is listening. Across the restaurant, roughly 40 feet away, a man in a plain gray jacket sits alone with a glass of bourbon he hasn't touched. He's watching them, not with anger, not with judgment, with the particular stillness of a man who has just made a decision and is now waiting for the right moment to act on it. The two men in the booth don't notice him yet. By the time they do, it will be too late to pretend the evening went differently. 43 people were in Chasen's that night. 14 of them would later say they saw what happened. 6 of them said they felt it before they saw it. A shift in temperature, a change in the room's frequency, the particular silence that falls when something real breaks through the surface of an ordinary evening. What happened in the next 4 minutes wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It left no visible damage. But the two men in that booth never laughed like that again. This is that story. Chasen's Restaurant, 9039, Beverly Boulevard, West Hollywood, February 14th, 1969. A Friday evening. The Valentine's Day crowd had filled the front rooms by 7 o'clock. By 8:30, the famous chili had sold out, a thing that happened perhaps 6 times a year, and Dave Chasen himself had moved through the dining room twice, greeting tables with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that his restaurant was not merely a place to eat, but a place where the industry's power arranged and rearranged itself in plain sight. The temperature outside was 51 degrees. Inside, it was warm in the way expensive restaurants manufacture warmth. Controlled, perfumed faintly with cedar and wool coats and the ghost of 100 dinners. The bar was doing brisk business. The booths along the east wall were full. The two men in the corner booth had been there since 7:15. Their names were Gerald Mawson and Carl Devere. Not names that appear in studio directories, not names attached to major credits, but names that carried weight in the specific geography of mid-level Hollywood production. Mawson was 44 years old. He had spent 19 years as an associate producer at 3 different studios, most recently at Columbia, where he'd shepherded 11 features through pre-production. None of them particularly distinguished, all of them profitable enough to ensure his continued employment. He was 5 feet 11, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who had played college football long enough to retain the physical confidence without retaining the discipline. He wore a charcoal suit with a pocket square folded precisely, and he spoke with the particular fluency of someone who had learned that the right tone of voice could substitute for the right substance. Devere was 38. He worked in talent representation, a junior partner at an agency that handled second-tier character actors and the occasional television director. He was sharp-featured, quick, the kind of man who could read a room accurately and then misread the room completely because the reading itself made him overconfident. He'd been in the industry 14 years. He had shaken hands with every important person in Hollywood at least once. He believed this meant something. Together they were, as one witness would later describe them, exactly the type of men who are very impressed with themselves in rooms where no one is impressed with them. They had been drinking steadily. Not drunk. Mawson especially was disciplined about that, a professional drinker in the Hollywood mold, always functional, never quite clear. The conversation had turned, as it sometimes does among men who believe themselves insulated from consequence, toward the contemptible. Seated 2 booths away from them, nursing a beer and reading the menu with the careful attention of a man who is in no hurry, was a young man in his mid-20s. His name was Robert Calloway. He was wearing his army dress uniform, the Class A greens, the dress shoes polished to regulation standard, the shoulder patch of the 1st Cavalry Division. He had arrived in Los Angeles 4 days earlier, rotated back from his 2nd tour in Vietnam. He was meeting someone for dinner, a cousin, according to the reservation book, and the cousin was late. Calloway sat quietly. He was thin in the way men returning from that particular war were often thin. Not from deprivation alone, but from a sustained expenditure of everything the body had. His face was composed. He had the eyes of someone who had learned, very recently, to be still in environments that weren't. Mawson noticed him first. The laughter started low. Devere caught the direction of Masson's glance, and his own expression shifted. The small, private shift of a man who has been invited to participate in something he knows is wrong, but finds momentarily more appealing than the alternative. The words came in fragments, not quite loud enough to be prosecuted, but fully loud enough to be heard by anyone paying attention. References to the war. References to the men who fought it. The particular cruelty of men who have never been tested, performing their contempt for men who have. Calloway heard it. He gave no sign that he heard it. He looked at his menu with the same careful attention. And here is where it changes. 40 feet away, in a booth facing the east wall, the man in the gray jacket set down his untouched bourbon glass with the precise care of a man placing something exactly where it needs to be. He had heard every word. John Wayne had come to Chasen's that evening without particular intention. This was not unusual. Since his cancer surgery in September 1964, the removal of his left lung and 2 ribs at Good Samaritan Hospital, a surgery his publicist had initially described as minor before the gravity of it became impossible to conceal, Wayne had adopted the habit of solitary evenings in familiar restaurants. Not out of melancholy, out of a preference for environments where he was known without being performed at. He was 61 years old, 6 feet 4 inches, roughly 220 pounds, though he had not fully recovered his pre-surgery weight and carried himself with the slightly deliberate posture of a man who has relearned how to breathe. The gray jacket was the kind he favored offset, unremarkable, functional, the jacket of a man who did not need his clothes to announce him. He had been seated for approximately 40 minutes when Gerald Mawson and Carl Devere began laughing. The people who knew Wayne well, the directors, the stuntmen, the wranglers and cameramen who had worked beside him across 30 years and 150 films, described a particular quality to his attention when something offended his sense of order. Not heat, not aggression, a cooling, a kind of subtraction, as though everything inessential had been removed, leaving only the decision. His hands were large, genuinely large in the way hands become when they have worked at things for decades, wrapping reins, gripping rigging, absorbing the torque of physical work across hundreds of production days. He set those hands flat on the table. He looked at the 2 men in the booth for perhaps 15 seconds. His eyes did not move to Calloway. He had already assessed Calloway in the first minute the soldier sat down. The unit patch, the bearing, the careful way the young man held himself together in a public space where he was conspicuously out of place. He looked back at his bourbon. Then he looked at the booth again. Stanley Hollins, a character actor who had worked with Wayne on 3 pictures and was seated at the bar that evening, said later that he watched Wayne make the decision in real time. You could see it happen, Hollins recalled. Most men, when they're going to do something, you can see them getting ready, building up to it. Duke didn't build up to anything. He just arrived at it. Wayne pushed back his chair. The table nearest to him, 4 people, a couple and their dinner guests, felt it before they saw it. Not the movement. The absence of the stillness that had preceded it. Nobody in the room moved. The distance from Wayne's booth to Mawson and Devere's table was approximately 40 feet, though several witnesses later placed it at closer to 35. He covered it in 10 steps. He did not move quickly. He moved the way large, confident men move when they have decided something. Not urgently, not slowly, but with the particular unhurried precision that communicates that the outcome is not in question. He stopped at the edge of their booth. Mawson looked up first. The recognition took approximately 2 seconds. The double take, the recalibration, the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the radius of his insulation is smaller than he believed. Devere turned a half-second later, and his expression was different. Not recalibration, but a rapid internal accounting of whether what he had said was audible. It had been audible. Wayne said nothing for a moment. He looked at Mawson. He looked at Devere. He looked at the table between them. The drinks, the bread basket, the comfortable debris of men who believed they were beyond consequence. Then he said in a voice that was not raised, "I heard what you said." That was all. Mawson, to his credit, attempted a recovery. He was a man who had spent 19 years managing situations. He offered a version of the explanation that such men always offer. A misunderstanding, a joke, taken out of context. His voice was steady. His hands were less steady. Devere said nothing. He had the look of a man who has suddenly remembered several other obligations. The Wayne who stood at the edge of that booth was not the Wayne of the screen. Not Rooster Cogburn, not Ethan Edwards, not any of the 50 variations of cinematic authority he had constructed across 3 decades. This was something older and less performed than any of those. This was a man who had spent his childhood in Glendale during years of genuine deprivation, who had worked his way through USC on a partial scholarship before losing it, who had spent his 20s carrying furniture and hauling equipment on studio lots because John Ford would hire him for anything as long as he worked, who had made 3B pictures a year for a decade before anyone used the word star in connection with his name. A man who had been tested repeatedly by things that had nothing to do with cameras. He had also spent considerable time around the military. Not combat. His 4F status during World War II was a wound that never fully healed for him, a subject he rarely discussed and clearly never resolved. He had hosted USO tours. He had spent time in Korea in 1954, in Vietnam in 1966, on bases and in field hospitals, in the company of men who had done what he felt he had failed to do. He understood what the uniform meant because he had sat with the men who wore it in conditions that made the wearing of it very clear. He looked at Mawson again. "That young man," he said, nodding toward Calloway without taking his eyes off the table, "flew back from a war this week. He's sitting here in this restaurant in that uniform because he's got nowhere yet to put it. And you're making him into something for your entertainment." Mawson began another response. Wayne's expression did not change. Mawson stopped. Victor Laszlo, a Hungarian-born director who was dining that evening with his wife at a table 12 feet away, later described the silence that followed as having the quality of a stage direction that no one had written. The room simply stopped. A waiter named Paul Ricci, who had worked the east section of Chasen's for 6 years, was standing 4 feet away and later said, "I had a full tray. I didn't move it. I just stood there." And that's when the crowd went silent. Not the whole restaurant, but the 23 people within earshot, the couple at the nearest table, the 4 men at the bar with a direct sight line, the waiter with his tray. Every one of them stopped. In the silence, Robert Calloway turned around. What happened in the next 4 minutes contained no violence and very little volume. It was, in certain ways, the most precisely calibrated display of human authority that anyone in that room had ever witnessed. Because it was not a display at all. That was the thing that defied explanation. In the first seconds after Calloway turned, he saw Wayne, recognized him, because every American in 1969 knew that face. And his own expression went through a rapid series of adjustments. Confusion. Comprehension. A complicated dignity that the young man visibly chose to maintain because he understood, without being told, that the manner in which he received this moment was itself a form of service. Wayne looked at Calloway for the first time. Not at Mawson. Not at Devere. At the soldier. He said, "Welcome home." 2 words. The 2 most relevant words available, delivered without ornamentation. Something happened to Calloway's face in that moment that several witnesses independently described with the same word, which was crumbled. Not in weakness. In the specific way that composure crumbles when the exact right thing is said at the exact right time to the exact right person. He was 24 years old. He had served 2 tours. He had come home to an America that was in open argument about whether to treat men like him as victims, villains, or irrelevancies. His cousin was late. He was sitting alone in his uniform in a restaurant full of people who did not acknowledge him, and 2 of them had spent the last several minutes laughing. And then John Wayne had crossed 40 feet of restaurant floor to say, "Welcome home." Wayne turned back to the table. Mawson had done the calculation. He was, whatever his faults, a genuinely intelligent man, and intelligent men in untenable positions move quickly toward the nearest available exit. He had identified the exit. Genuine acknowledgement delivered quickly, before the situation could calcify further. But Wayne was not interested in a rapid resolution. This is the part that required understanding. Wayne was 61 years old. He had been formally recognized as having cancer 5 years earlier, and though the surgery was considered successful, no man of that age who has had a lung removed lives without the awareness that time is finite and therefore things that matter need to be said completely. He had spent years in the company of professional soldiers. He had sat with dying men in field hospitals in Vietnam in 1966, had held the hands of men 25 and 26 years old who used their last coherence to send messages to families back home. He understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with ideology, exactly what a combat soldier returning from that particular war was carrying. And he understood exactly what 2 men laughing at that soldier, in that restaurant, on that February evening, meant. He was not going to let Masson's strategic acknowledgement become the resolution of this. "Tell him," Wayne said, and the quietness of his voice was the quietness of something that will not be redirected. Masson blinked. "Tell him you're sorry." The three words arranged themselves in the air of the booth with the finality of a door closing. Devere was completely still. He had understood, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, that there was no version of this evening in which he emerged as anything other than what he was. The question was only what level of what he was he would demonstrate in the next 30 seconds. Masson looked at Wayne for a long moment. Then he looked at Calloway, who had turned back toward his own booth and was facing away from them, giving them, with a deliberateness that suggested considerable maturity for 24, the option of a private apology. What happened in the next 30 seconds was witnessed by fewer people. Masson stood up from the booth. He walked to Calloway's table. He spoke for approximately 20 seconds. Calloway did not turn around immediately. He let the words arrive and settle. Then he turned, and he looked at Masson, and he nodded once, a nod with the particular economy of a man who has learned, in environments where communication needed to be efficient, to let one gesture carry exactly as much weight as necessary and no more. Then he turned back to his menu. Masson returned to the booth. For the remaining time, neither he nor Devere spoke above a murmur. Wayne returned to his own table. Stanley Hollins, watching from the bar, counted 7 seconds of complete silence after Wayne sat down before the room's ambient noise reassembled itself. He said later that in 40 years of watching people in rooms, he had never seen a space empty of sound like that. Not from drama, not from fear, but from the collective processing of something that had just happened that the witnesses couldn't quite categorize. What happened next, nobody expected. Paul Ricci, the waiter, moved to Wayne's table without being signaled. He set down a fresh bourbon. He said, "On the house, Mr. Wayne." Wayne looked at the glass. He looked at Ricci. He said, "Put it on my tab." He wasn't being difficult. He simply did not want the evening to be about him receiving something. He had come to the table to do a thing, and the thing was done, and he would pay for his own drink. That's not stubbornness. That's a philosophy. At 9:47 that evening, as the restaurant had begun to thin, Gerald Masson did something that was not required of him and was not expected. He walked to Wayne's table alone. Devere had left at 9:30, a departure that Masson himself would describe years later as the most eloquent thing Carl ever did, and he didn't mean it to be. Masson stood at the edge of Wayne's booth. Wayne looked at him without invitation or refusal. Masson sat down. He was quiet for a moment in the way men are quiet when they are not preparing a defense, but are genuinely attempting to locate what they actually want to say. It is a different kind of quiet from the silence of avoidance. You can tell the difference if you know what to look for. He said, "I don't know how to explain what that was." Wayne said nothing. "I've been in this city for 20 years, Masson continued. "I've sat at tables with generals. I've shaken hands with senators. I've produced pictures about the war, 3 of them, actually. And I sat 20 feet from a kid who actually went, and He didn't finish the sentence. Wayne picked up his bourbon. He said, "The pictures aren't the war." Masson said, "No. The pictures are about the war," Wayne said. "That's different. The pictures let you feel something without paying the price for it. That's what they're for. But when the man who paid the price is sitting right there," he set the glass down, "you don't get to borrow the feeling and hand him the bill." Masson was quiet for a long time. This was the philosophical principle behind the action. Not the mechanics of crossing a restaurant floor, not the authority of celebrity, but something older and more specific than either. The idea that proximity to suffering confers obligation. That the man in the uniform had paid for something that the men at the table had only consumed aesthetically. That the distance between a movie about war and a man who came back from one is not a gap of information but a gap of cost. And that acknowledging that gap, actively, visibly, in front of others, is not an inconvenience but a minimum. Wayne had been sitting with this his entire adult life. The 4F classification had ensured that he never closed the distance himself. He had spent decades in the company of men who had, trying to understand what he owed them and how it could be paid. The USO tours, the field hospital visits, the films that he believed at his best were genuine attempts to honor what those men had done rather than merely exploit it. It was never enough, and he knew it was never enough, and he went on paying anyway. What happened at Robert Calloway's table was not a performance of that philosophy. It was the philosophy in motion, Automatic, reflexive, the way a body moves toward heat or away from danger. The decision had been made before Wayne was consciously aware of having made it. That is what 30 years of genuinely held belief does to a person. It removes the gap between the principle and the act. Mawson said, "I didn't know I believed the things I apparently believe until tonight." Wayne looked at him for a long moment. "Most men don't," he said. "Until they have to." He extended his hand. Mawson shook it. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was the handshake of two men who have reached the clear end of an honest conversation and have chosen, mutually, to leave it there. Mawson stood up. He put on his coat. At the door, he stopped without turning around. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Years later, Gerald Mawson spoke about that evening publicly for the first time in an interview with a trade publication in 1981. He was 56 years old. He had left Columbia in 1972 and spent the following decade producing what he described as smaller pictures with larger questions. 3 independent features, all of them concerning men returned from war. None were commercially successful. 2 were genuinely good. One was screened at a veterans hospital in San Diego in 1979, and a man who had served 2 tours in Vietnam sat in the back row and did not leave when the credits rolled and asked to see it again immediately. Mawson told the interviewer, "I spent 3 years making pictures about soldiers because I needed to understand what I'd been laughing at. Not what I'd done. What I'd been laughing at. There's a difference. What I'd done was a moment. What I'd been laughing at was a habit. And the habit was much more dangerous than the moment." He said he had tried for years to articulate exactly what John Wayne had done in Chasen's that night, to explain its mechanism, to reverse engineer its authority. He had eventually concluded that there was nothing to engineer. "He just cared more than I did," Mawson said. "That's the whole explanation. He cared more about what that kid represented than I cared about my own comfort. That's not complicated. It's just incredibly rare." Carl Devere never discussed the evening. He continued working in talent representation until 1977, then moved to real estate. Robert Calloway, according to records that were pieced together much later, stayed in Los Angeles for 3 weeks after that evening. He eventually settled in San Antonio, Texas, where he worked for many years as a high school history teacher. A former student, recalling Calloway in a 2003 community newspaper piece, described a habit Calloway had of pausing mid-lesson when the class was particularly inattentive and saying something that the students eventually memorized because he said it so often. "The reason you get to sit in that chair and not pay attention is because somebody paid the price for the chair. The least you can do is know that." Nobody in that class knew where the line came from. Calloway never told them. Return, for a moment, to the image that opened this story, a corner booth at Chasen's restaurant, Beverly Hills, February 1969. 2 men laughing. A soldier reading a menu. A man in a gray jacket watching from 40 feet away with a glass of bourbon he has not touched. The question the image asks is not, what did John Wayne do? The question is, what does a man do when the cost of action is inconvenience, and the cost of inaction is someone else's dignity? 43 people were in that room. 14 saw it. 1 man crossed the floor. He didn't cross it because he was famous. He crossed it because he believed something, and the distance between what he believed and what he was watching was 40 feet and 30 years, and a draft classification and 100 field hospital visits, and every film he had ever made about men at war. When he got there, he paid what he owed. That's not a Hollywood story. That's a human story that happened to have a famous man in it. 1 decision. 1 floor. 1 soldier who came home and found out, in the most unexpected room, that someone was glad he had. But there was 1 confrontation from John Wayne's final years that he never discussed publicly. Not with his family, not with the press, not even with John Ford, who by then was dying and would have understood. A confrontation that didn't happen in a restaurant or on a film set, but in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning with a man who had every reason to hate him. The reason Wayne kept it quiet, and what happened between those 2 men, that's a story for another time.